Have you ever stopped to think that the silence we seek today to relax was once a cruel burden carried by thousands of women? It's curious. While many see the Victorian era as synonymous with luxury and elegance, the truth hidden in the hallways of mansions was very different. Behind heavy wooden doors, the maid's routine was anything but glamorous. It was repetitive, tiring, and in many cases suffocating. And herein lies the controversy. The seemingly perfect life of English families only existed because there were those who woke before the sun, silently swept ashes, and served tea without ever being noticed. The paradox is this: the brilliance of Victorian high society only existed because someone remained invisible. Seems unfair, doesn't it? Well, it won't. You may never have heard this story this way because books almost always focus on queens, ladies, and parties. But today, I want to take you to the hidden side of the story. Let's walk together through these women's grueling day and discover how their lives can teach us about discipline, resilience, and at the same time, about the injustices that still resonate today. Be prepared. This isn't a fast paced or exciting narrative. It's slow, almost monotonous, and precisely for this reason, it can help you relax, disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the present, and even, who knows, fall asleep. But while you're doing this, you'll notice curious details that are rarely told. Now, before we begin, comment below where you're from and what time it is there. I'd love to know where in the world and at what time of day the story will take you. It was still dark when the maid woke, even before the rooster crowed. Her body craved a few more minutes of rest, but duty wouldn't let up. Getting up at 5 in the morning wasn't a choice, it was an obligation. Many of us today complain about waking up early for work, but back then there were no electronic alarm clocks or coffee making machines. Only discipline and social pressure guided the rhythm of our awakening. The silence of the mansion was almost sacred. The maid's every step had to be calculated so as not to wake the sleeping gentleman upstairs. Imagine trying to walk across an ancient wooden floor without creaking the boards, a constant challenge. The slightest distraction could result in a scolding from the housekeeper, or worse, public humiliation. Today, when we step onto the cold kitchen floor to get a glass of water, we rarely think of those who once had to live in a permanent state of alert. Their first task wasn't eating or stretching, but starting to prepare the world for others. While we today open our phones and check messages, they woke up with buckets and rags in hand. Their day didn't begin with choices, but with obligation. Interestingly, there's a lesson here. Starting the day by putting energy into something outside of ourselves can train the mind for discipline, although, of course, under less extreme condition. The morning chill bit at the skin, and often there wasn't even hot water to wash one's face. Think of the difference. Today, a hot shower is as simple as turning on a faucet. For them, it was an unattainable luxury, and this comparison helps us understand how the routine we call tiring is often a privilege in disguise. After all, who would have thought that carrying a made bed and a hot coffee in the morning was once a distant dream for so many people? Rising before the sun also held a curious symbolism. The maid awoke to illuminate the lives of others, but remained in the shadow of her own story. She was invisible, yet essential. We almost never think that our early Monday morning rush might have something in common with the silent rush of these women of the past. But when we stop to think, we realize that the hours stolen from sleep carry a similar weight, even in such different contexts. And it's precisely at this point that the plot of their lives begins to intensify. If the day was already demanding from the very first minutes, imagine what would come next when the entire mansion awakens and the pace quickens. That's when the routine reveals its even heavier side. The silence in that immense house wasn't just an absence of sound, but almost an invisible law governing the maid's every movement. Walking through the hallways was like dancing on glass. Each step had to be light, calculated as if the air itself could betray her presence. Today, we stumble in our slippers in the middle of the night without much thought. Back then, a simple creak in the floorboards could result in a severe scolding. Their hands worked gently, arranging furniture, wiping surfaces, opening heavy wooden doors without making the hinges creak. It was as if silence were a form of armor protecting the maid from unwanted glances. Interestingly, in our modern daily lives, this mindfulness resembles the practice of meditation or mindfulness, except that in their case, there was no choice or inner peace, only the need to survive the imposed discipline. It's interesting to think that we live surrounded by noise, notifications on our phones, car engines, televisions, to the Victorian maid. All this noise would have been a strange luxury, perhaps even disturbing. But there was also something almost artistic in the way they moved. Opening a curtain without making a sound, folding heavy sheets without hearing the fabric rub, walking with measured steps, like someone rehearsing a silent play. This forced training to avoid any sound makes us think about how we deal with talking less today. How many times has someone told us, be quiet, don't interrupt, wait your turn? The difference is that for us, this may be fleeting. For them, it was constant. If you've ever walked into a library and felt the tension in the air at the slightest whisper, you might understand a little of the weight of this daily imposed silence. At times, the silence became oppressive. The maid not only stopped speaking, but also erased part of her identity. It was as if the absence of sound was also the absence of existence. A life where one couldn't laugh out loud, hum a tune, or simply sigh without fear of reprimand. And let's face it, we've all had that moment when we swallowed our words to avoid trouble. Imagine living like that from dawn to dusk. And yet, despite all this weight, the silence was only the prelude to what was to come. Because soon after, what seemed simple became arduous, cleaning the fireplaces, a task that required strength, patience, and even more silence. Each morning, before the sun even warmed the windows, the maid was already standing in front of the first fireplace. The previous night's fire had left its mark, fine ashes, bits of burnt coal, soot clinging to the interior walls. She had to remove everything carefully without spreading dust, as if she were dismantling a secret kept in flames. Imagine having to repeat this process in several rooms, one after the other, like someone who never reaches the end of a road. The smell of soot permeated their clothes and skin. There were no scented soaps or creams to mask the constant smoky odor. It was as if their bodies bore, day after day, the invisible mark of their. Anyone who has ever cleaned a barbecue grill after a Sunday barbecue knows the pain. Now multiply that by 10, 20, 30 fireplaces every day. This routine not only tired the body, but also wore down the spirit. The work also required strength. You had to bend down, scrape, scrub, and carry buckets of still warm ash. Your hands would blacken, your nails would break, and your breath would carry particles that scratched your throat. Today, with vacuum cleaners and modern cleaning products, it would be easy to fix in minutes. But back then, every fireplace was practically a battle fought with patience and endurance. Interestingly, there's a hidden lesson in this, dealing with what's left over from the previous day. Just as the maid had to remove what the fire had left so a new one could be born, we too need, from time to time, to clear our own inner ash. It could mean letting go of resentments, old habits, or even that pile of papers that insists on growing on your desk. The process is tedious, but liberating, and there was no pause after completing the cleaning. A ready fireplace only meant another one awaited. It was like running a race with no finish line. When the master woke and came down to the hall, the fire would be lit again, glowing as if it had been kept alive all night. This seemingly small detail was proof that the maid's invisible efforts were what maintained the illusion of comfort in the house. But if cleaning a fireplace was already exhausting, carrying heavy coal to feed it was even worse. And this was precisely the next step, a literally heavy task that turned the routine into something almost endless. The mansion's cold corridors became even heavier when the maid appeared with a bucket of coal in her hands. There were no shortcuts. She climbed and descended narrow staircases, crossed long halls, and with each trip, the weight seemed to double. Imagine carrying overflowing grocery bags, but without rest, repeatedly throughout the day. This was the kind of effort that shaped the body without ever bringing recognition. The sound of coal clanging inside the bucket accompanied each step, like a metallic reminder of the daily grind. The black dust permeated the air, stuck to the skin, and soiled the light-colored uniform that was supposed to be kept impeccable. Interestingly, this contradiction, having to work in dirt and still remain presentable, is something many today face in different ways. How many times has someone smiled exhaustedly in a meeting, trying to hide the tiredness from the previous night? When coal was poured into the fireplace, it gave off a harsh smell that mixed dust and smoke. Each time, the maid had to make sure the amount was enough to maintain the heat, but not so much as to be careless. Today, all it takes is the push of a button on the electric heater, and the temperature rises in seconds. It's easy to forget that for the comfort of a Victorian family, there were calloused hands carrying weight inside. Interestingly, this scene reminds us of how progress changes our priorities. What once required physical strength and hours of dedication can now be solved in moments. But has this ease also made us less aware of the value of small things? Perhaps the next time you feel the warmth of the heater or electric fireplace, it might be worth remembering that once upon a time there were those who had to pay this price in sweat. And the most intriguing thing is that transporting coal wasn't an occasional task. It was a daily repetition, like an inflexible clock, a cycle that never completed because the next day it all started again. The weight that seemed to lift when emptying the bucket soon returned to the hands on another trip through the icy corridors. It was a cruel reminder that the effort was never ending. And once the stage was complete, there was no time for rest, because while the embers began to smolder, another mission called, discreetly preparing morning tea, which had to be ready as if it had magically appeared on the master's table. Preparing morning tea was almost an invisible ritual. Before the masters opened their eyes, the maid was already moving silently around the kitchen. The iron kettle creaked over the fire, letting out a slow hiss, and the aroma of dried leaves began to waft through the air. There was no glory in this gesture, only the obligation that when the family came downstairs, everything would be in its proper place, as if it had sprung from the table by magic. The tea leaves came in small metal tins, carefully stored because they were expensive and precious. Mixed with boiling water, they released an earthy aroma that filled the stuffy kitchen. The bread, meanwhile, needed to be fresh, which required kneading the dough before dawn. Today, All you have to do is open a package at the supermarket or put capsules in the coffee maker. But back then, every detail was handcrafted, the result of human effort. The curious thing is that this simple scene conveys a lot about the difference between serving and being served. For the maid, there was no choice of flavors, no pause to sample. She simply ensured the tea was at the right temperature, in the right china, at the right time. It's like when in the present, someone throws a party and doesn't enjoy it because they're too busy taking care of every detail. Some call it dedication. For them, it was survival. The sound of cups being placed on the tray sounded like a test of patience. The slightest slip could result in severe complaints. Ooh. Have you ever stopped to think how disturbing the sound of dishes clanging can be in certain environments? Now, imagine living in constant tension so that no gesture would be interpreted as carelessness. This extreme care reveals a lot about how power manifested itself in even the smallest things. While the kettle was still steaming, the maid had to hurry. The clock was relentless, and the tea had to be ready exactly when the masters woke up. Being even minutes late could tarnish her reputation, and as if that weren't enough, everything had to be done in secret, almost like a ghost who brews and then disappears, a presence revealed only by the scent of freshly poured tea. And when the tray was finally delivered, there was no time to breathe. Because as the family settled in to enjoy their first meal, another figure appeared on the scene. The housekeeper, the great overseer, who kept all the gears running smoothly. The housekeeper was the constant shadow that loomed over each maid. She didn't shout as loudly as her employers, but her presence carried even more weight, as she was the one who defined the boundaries between tolerable error and unforgivable blunder. With a stern gaze and firm steps, she seemed to have eyes on every corner of the mansion. Today, we could compare her to a demanding manager who monitors every email and every minute of the workday, always alert for the slightest slip up. Dressed more soberly and elegantly than the others, the housekeeper carried a set of keys attached to her waist. This metallic jingle was a reminder of authority, almost like the badge many carry in the corporate environment. With it, she had access to supply closets, locked rooms, and even safes. She was the guardian not only of the tasks, but also of the family's trust. Her power came precisely from the invisible control she exercised. Each morning, she meted out orders with precision, as if she were a maestro conducting a silent orchestra. Each maid received her share, and there was no room for excuses. If many today feel suffocated by packed schedules and productivity apps, imagine living under an inflexible schedule dictated by someone who wouldn't tolerate even a second's delay. For the housekeeper, punctuality was a virtue and obedience was law. But despite the harshness, there was also a strange form of respect. Many young maids saw the governess as an example of advancement. After all, she too had started at the bottom and now held a position of authority. She was like that coworker who, after years of effort, becomes a leader and serves as an inspiration, although she still represents constant pressure. This ambiguity made the relationship tense, but also admirable. The curious thing is that the governess not only controlled schedules, but also behaviors. She decided what could be said, how each person should behave, even the acceptable tone of voice. It was an almost psychological surveillance. Anyone who has ever had a strict teacher who imposed discipline even in the way they breathe can perhaps sense a hint of this atmosphere. And yet many maids saw in her a chance to learn and perhaps dream of a different future. However, The housekeeper's rigid hierarchy was merely a reflection of the larger structure that divided all functions within the house. And further on, the routine revealed how this hierarchy spread among the maids themselves in layers that extended from the kitchen to the master's bedroom. Within the mansion, not all maids were created equal. There was a clear, almost military like hierarchy that determined who commanded whom and what tasks each person was responsible for. At the top were the personal chambermaids, who directly served their masters. Next came the cooks, who were the absolute masters of the kitchen, followed by the scullery maids, responsible for the meals and drinks. Lastly, the cleaning ladies, who carried the heaviest and least prestigious burden. It was a world within a world, with invisible but deeply felt divisions. This hierarchy determined not only the tasks, but also the dignity associated with each role. Being a chambermaid meant closeness to family and access to fine clothes and jewelry. Cleaning staff rarely saw their bosses up close. It's like the modern job market. Some work in air conditioned offices while others brave extreme heat or cold on the streets, performing equally essential but often invisible work. Interestingly, even among people living under exploitation, distinctions emerged. The chambermaids looked down on the scullery maids with a certain superiority, and the scullery maids, in turn, looked down on the basement maids. This feeling of being better than someone else was a kind of defense mechanism, a way of coping with their own condition. Deep down, they all carried heavy burdens, but the hierarchy created an illusion of stat. This system also influenced dreams and ambitions. A young woman who started out cleaning floors might harbor the desire to one day be promoted to maid, or with great effort, reach the position of chambermaid. It was like someone entering a company in an entry-level position and dreaming of climbing the ladder to leadership. This expectation, though difficult to achieve, kept the maids constantly disciplined. But behind this, there were also silent disputes and tensions. After all, each role carried different privileges. The chambermaid got better food, the cook had control over the menu, the waitress controlled the finest china. Small details that together created internal rivalries. Anyone who has worked in a team knows well how different roles can generate conflict, even when everyone shares the same effort. And this hierarchy became even clearer when we observed the role of the personal chambermaids, those who not only served, but accompanied the ladies of the house in every detail of their routine, from dressing to preparing for social events. The personal chambermaid's role went far beyond arranging clothes. She was almost a shadow of the lady of the house, always available, attentive to the smallest detail. From the moment the lady woke up, the chambermaid was there ready to select dresses, arrange petticoats, and prepare accessories. Today, we might compare her to a stylist or exclusive image consultant, but without the glamour or prestige those professions carry. She was the one who spent hours handling heavy fabrics, full of layers, buttons, and ties. Dressing a Victorian lady was no simple task. It required patience, technique, and strength. Imagine having to fasten dozens of tiny buttons with tired hands while listening to complaints about being late for a social engagement. This routine reminds us that behind every elegant ballroom appearance, there was invisible work sustaining the scene. Besides the clothes, the chambermaid also took care of the hair and jewelry. Ladies expected to appear impeccable, and any hair out of place could be grounds for reprimand. Interestingly, this dedication makes us reflect on how personal image still plays a central role in our society. Many spend hours getting ready before an online meeting or posting a photo on social media. deep down, the pressure to look presentable remained. But there was an even deeper detail. The chambermaid not only served, but also witnessed secrets. She overheard intimate conversations, witnessed hidden tears, and sometimes even shared confidences. This position made her invisible and at the same time indispensable. She was like that employee who never appears in company photos but knows everything that goes on behind the scenes. A delicate position, one of trust and silence. However, this closeness didn't equate to true friendship. It was a relationship marked by inequality. A lady might treat her chambermaid kindly one day and issue cold orders the next. Emotional dependence was elusive, and this ambiguity is very reminiscent of certain modern relationships in which someone believes they have personal ties at work, but discovers that it all comes down to the role they perform. And while the chambermaid adjusted dresses and hairstyles, other maids were on another mission, ensuring that every corner of the house shone with polished furniture and gleaming objects in a daily battle against dust and wear and tear. Polishing was one of those jobs that never ended. As soon as one piece of furniture was clean, another seemed to be crying out for attention. Maids would spend hours scrubbing dark wood until it reflected the dim candlelight. It was as if every surface in the house was a mirror of the family's reputation. Today, when someone gives a quick wipe to the table before receiving guests, they can hardly imagine that back then, this process was almost a daily marathon. Silverware required even more care. Spoons, glasses, and candlesticks needed to shine without tarnishing, and the slightest oversight could be interpreted as a lack of diligence. Cleaning products were rudimentary, often based on abrasive powder and rough cloths, which hurt hands. Anyone who has ever cleaned silverware for a party knows how laborious it is. Now multiply that by the dozens of pieces used at each dinner. It was a ritual of patience and precision. And then there was the floor. Waxing entire wooden hallways was a laborious task, requiring repetitive, almost mechanical movements. The scent of wax wafted through the air, permeating the room and the maid's clothes. Interestingly, this sweet aroma can still evoke the feeling of a clean house, but for them it was just another daily reminder that the work was never done. This constant effort raises an interesting reflection. How often do we strive to keep up appearances? The mansion needed to shine not out of necessity, but to demonstrate status. Similarly, today, many people exhaust themselves to maintain a flawless image on social media, even if behind the screen they're exhausted. It's the same illusory shine, just in a different guise. The cruel detail was that after all this effort, recognition rarely came. Guests praised the splendor of the house, but no one remembered who scrubbed every corner until their arms ached. It was invisible work, and perhaps that's the most unfair part. The extreme dedication that fades into obscurity in the shadow of others' luxury. And while one maid finished polishing the furniture, another was already immersed in an even more arduous routine, facing the suffocating heat and intense odors of the kitchen, the true beating heart of the Victorian house. The kitchen of a Victorian mansion was like another world, hidden in the basement or in annexes, away from the main hall. The heat was constant, coming from wood-burning ovens that never went out, as there was always something to cook, roast, or simmer. The air was dense, thick with smoke and steam, mingling with the odors of meats, broths, spices, and even burning coal. For the servants, breathing there wasn't synonymous with gastronomic pleasure, but with daily endurance. The cooks were central figures, though little recognized. They planned complex menus, which varied depending on the number of guests, the prestige of the dinner, or the season. Their assistants chopped vegetables, kneaded dough, and prepared sauces, all at a rapid pace. It's like in a large company, the boss appears to receive praise, but there's an entire invisible team behind the scenes, ensuring every detail is executed correctly. The heat was so intense that sweat dripped constantly, soaking through clothes and aprons, and there were no fans, much less air conditioning. The clanging of pots and pans, slicing knives, and bubbling cauldrons created a metallic, almost deafening sound. Anyone who has walked into a restaurant kitchen on a busy night can imagine the scene, but it would still be far from the intensity these women face daily. The curious thing is that despite all its harshness, the kitchen was also a place of communal living. Between one pot and the next, quick conversations, confidences, and even muffled laughter would emerge. It was, paradoxically, a space of physical and human warmth. Perhaps that's why many of us still associate the kitchen, to this day, with a place of family gatherings. But for the maids, this association was accompanied by extreme fatigue, and there were also risks. Burns were frequent, cuts to the hands were almost inevitable, and any accident could result in time off work, which meant losing a livelihood. There was no insurance, no available doctor, and no workers' rights. Each wound was treated improvised, and the routine continued the next day as if nothing had happened. But while in the kitchen, time seemed to pass at a frantic pace. In other parts of the house, the routine followed a different rhythm, marked by mechanical and unhurried repetition. The endless washing of clothes in the laundry room. The life of a Victorian maid was marked by an almost hypnotic repetition. Each morning brought the same steps, the same gestures, as if time were trapped in an endless cycle. It was waking, cleaning, loading, serving, and the next day, repeating it all over again. Unlike today, when even routine jobs involve breaks, holidays, or small changes, back then, routine was like a scratched record that never stopped playing. This mechanical pattern made the body get used to it, but the mind became even more tired. After all, human beings seek novelty, small different stimuli that add flavor to life. The absence of this turned the hours into a gray blur, making it difficult to even distinguish one day from the next. Anyone who has lived through periods where every day seems the same, like lockdowns or long waits, can understand this silent exhaustion. And there was no room for creativity. The cloth had to be ironed the same way, the fireplace arranged the same way, the food served with the same label. Any mistake or improvisation was unwelcome. It was seen as carelessness. It's as if a factory worker today decided to innovate an assembly line process. The result would be an immediate scolding. For the maids, innovation was synonymous with danger. Breathless routine caused even the body to go into automatic mode. Hands moved without thinking, feet walked down corridors without even noticing the route. How many times have we driven a familiar route and upon arriving, forgotten the route? This state of repetition demonstrates how the mind creates shortcuts, but for them, this meant losing the sense of living in the present. Interestingly, the same tedious rhythm can be seen as a metaphor for modern life, when many complain about the office routine or the constant barrage of household chores. But there's an important difference. Today we have leisure options, technological distractions, and personal choices that break the monotony. For those women, there was no escape. It was repetition ad nauseum, with no escape valve. And if the day already seemed heavy due to the repetition of tasks, There was still one aspect that increased the suffering: the laundry, where bed linens and long dresses required almost superhuman efforts to be impeccable. The laundry room was undoubtedly one of the most unforgiving places in the mansion. There, maids faced endless piles of heavy sheets and dresses, plunging fabrics into enormous vats of boiling water. Steam filled the room, fogging windows and making it difficult to breathe. Anyone who's ever washed clothes in a tub knows how tiring it is. But imagine multiplying that for hours without breaks and with items that weighed several kilograms when wet. The task began early and continued at an almost inhuman pace, rubbing every fold of fabric, removing grease or wine stains, all required patience and physical strength. There were no washing machines or effective chemicals, just handmade soap, stiff brushes, and tireless arms. The constant sound of water lapping against fabrics created a repetitive musical backdrop, almost like a rhythmic beat that never ceased. After washing, the clothes had to be boiled in cauldrons to sanitize them. The heat rose like a suffocating cloud, making the environment even more unbearable. Many maids emerged with reddened, almost raw skin, the result of minor burns or prolonged contact with the hot water, and yet the work never stopped. There was always another pile waiting for attention, like a tide that never recedes. Ironing clothes was another challenge. Irons were heavy, made of cast iron, heated directly over a fire. A single careless step could burn fabric or even skin. Imagine the risk of handling incandescent objects all day long without protective gear. Today, when complaining about ironing a shirt with a steam iron, it's almost impossible to imagine the literal and symbolic weight of this task in the past. And finally came the folding and organizing stage. Huge sheets needed to be aligned. Without wrinkles, voluminous dresses required careful wrinkling, and everything had to be stored impeccably. This final step, while less physically strenuous, required absolute concentration. After all, a single poorly executed crease could result in hours of extra work. It was the perfect routine to teach that even the most trivial details carry enormous weight when it comes to discipline. And when the clothes were finally ready, the maids still faced another challenge: walking up and down the stairs of the house, taking everything back to the bedrooms and closets in an endless up and down that wore out both body and mind. The stairs were the invisible link between all the worlds in the mansion, from the dark basement, where the kitchen was located, to the luxurious bedrooms on the upper floors. Each step was conquered at the cost of constant physical effort, climbing up and down dozens of times a day. Carrying buckets, clothes, or trays was like running a marathon with no finish line. Today, when someone complains about the building's broken elevator, they rarely imagine that in the past, the up and down journey was a mandatory routine. The steps were narrow, made of worn wood, creaking under the weight of each step. The lighting was dim, provided by oil lamps, and a single careless step was all it took to trip. The risk of falling was real, but the maids learned to balance weight with agility. Imagine holding a fine china tray full of cups and still having to run up the stairs to deliver them on time. Your heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the need to not fail. Physical exhaustion was inevitable. Sore knees, swollen ankles, and backaches accompanied each maid at the end of the day. But there was no time to complain or recover. The stairs called again, with another task to be accomplished. This effort makes us reflect on how we value gyms and planned workouts today. For them, Training was imposed by necessity, without rest or glamour. Interestingly, the stairs also symbolize the social division within the house. While their masters rarely descended to the basements, the maids spent their lives moving between floors, always on the move, always connecting worlds that never quite met. It was like living on an invisible border. On one side, luxury, on the other, sweat, and they were the bridge that supported this difference. The sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways was almost a soundtrack to everyday life. The creaking of wood, the hurried tapping of simple shoes, everything blended into the mansion's rhythm. Anyone who's lived in old houses might remember that distinctive sound, betraying every movement. For the maids, this sound did not bring nostalgia, but a constant reminder that the work was far from over. And if the stairs represented physical effort and risk, there was still another burden to bear: the imposed anonymity, the obligation to be invisible while maintaining the entire functioning of the house. Being a servant meant existing in the shadows. The unspoken rule was simple: the less noticed, the better. They walked the hallways like ghosts, silently opening doors, picking up forgotten objects, and tidying up details before anyone noticed their presence. Today, many people seek visibility and recognition, but back then, survival depended precisely on being invisible. It was a cruel paradox, working hard so that others could live in comfort, yet never being remembered for it. This invisibility wasn't just physical, but also social. Masters would walk past their maids without even looking them in the eye, as if they were part of the furniture. The feeling of not fully existing slowly eroded. Anyone who's ever felt ignored in a meeting or conversation knows the discomfort. Now imagine living under that condition every day. It was a constant exercise in erasing one's own presence. Interestingly, this anonymity also required skill. The maids had to calculate every move to avoid getting in their employer's way. The simple act of passing through a hallway at the wrong time could generate complaint. It was almost an invisible choreography, with each step required mental rehearsal. Anyone who has worked backstage at a major event understands this process: being present but never stealing the spotlight. The most painful thing was realizing that, even when they were noticed, they weren't seen as people. A maid might be reprimanded for a poorly made bed, but she rarely received praise for impeccable work. It was as if her existence was tied only to mistakes, never to successes. This dynamic is very reminiscent of the feeling of employees who only receive attention when something goes wrong, and who remain forgotten when everything is going well. And then there was the psychological impact: constantly erasing oneself, repressing spontaneous gestures, controlling the tone of one's voice, and even the way one breathed, created a life of constant tension. It was like wearing a mask every day, never able to take it off. This invisible pressure left deep scars, even if no one saw them. And, as contradictory as it may seem, this invisibility was accompanied by an opposite requirement: to maintain discipline in uniform and posture, as if one's appearance were, at the same time, invisible and impeccable. The uniform was more than just a garment. It was a symbol of discipline and submission. The dark clothes hid stains from hard work, while the white apron served as a contrast of purity and order. The tied-up hair, with no loose strands, reinforced the idea of control and sobriety. Every detail conveyed the message that the maid was not an ordinary person, but an extension of the house rules. Today, when we think of school or corporate uniforms, it's impossible not to notice echoes of this same logic. Taking care of one's appearance wasn't a luxury, but an obligation. Even after long hours of scrubbing, carrying, and cleaning, the maid was expected to keep her uniform neat. A loose button, a wrinkled apron, it was enough to draw criticism. It was as if the clothes spoke for themselves, as if the silence of the uniform were their true presentation to their bosses. Anyone who has worked in places where image is everything understands this burden well. Interestingly, the uniform also served as a tool of erasure. It eliminated personal differences, nullified individuality. It didn't matter what face, age, or tastes each maid had. Dressed the same way, they became part of a collective, indistinct, and easily controlled body. It's like in certain modern companies where everyone wears the same color, sits at identical desks, and follows standardized schedules. Uniformity facilitates command, but kills uniqueness. The uniform, however, also offered a paradoxical layer of protection. It hid wounds, disguised sweat stains, and in a way created a barrier between the maid and the direct judgment of her personal appearance. It was like a discreet, heavy, yet protective armor, and perhaps that's why, to this day, uniforms carry this dual role, suffocating identity, but also protecting from the gaze of others. Keeping the uniform impeccable, even amidst grueling tasks, was an exercise in patience. After all, there were no modern machines or steam irons. It was necessary to wash by hand, press with a charcoal iron, and manually sew any wear and tear. A forgotten detail could become a pretext for reprimand. The uniform, therefore, wasn't just clothing, it was a daily responsibility. And even though they were flawless on the outside, these women rarely had time to take care of themselves on the inside. After all, even a meal break was rushed, done in secret in reserved areas of the house. The maid's meals were more of a duty than a pleasure. There was no lavish table setting, nor long conversations. Eating was done quickly, in silence, almost like a clandestine act. The bread was hard, the soup thin, and often the leftovers from the master's dinner became the maid's main course. Today, when someone complains about rushing to eat lunch in front of the computer, they may not realize that in the past, such haste was a rule of survival. The location also spoke volumes. The maids didn't sit in brightly lit rooms, but in stuffy corners, secondary kitchens, or basements. The space was cramped, with almost no ventilation, and eating times were strictly timed. It was as if, even at meal times, the distance between them and their employers had to be reinforced. Eating in secret meant, ultimately, existing in secret. And then there was the psychological factor. You never knew when you'd be called back to attend to an urgent family need. The meal was constantly interrupted by unexpected orders. Imagine trying to relax while knowing that at any moment someone might shout your name and demand your presence. This tension made mealtime less of a pleasure and more of an anxiety-inducing experience. Compared to today, it's like when your cell phone vibrates during lunch and you feel compelled to answer immediately. The difference is that for them, ignoring this call wasn't an option. It meant risking their job, their housing, and even their dignity. The simple act of chewing calmly could be interpreted as laziness. This pressure reveals how even the most basic rest was denied. Mealtime, which should have been a break to replenish energy, became just another extension of work. The maids gulped down quickly to get back to their routine, almost like machines fueled in a hurry to keep working. Their bodies craved a break, but discipline demanded constant movement. This contradiction explains much of the physical and mental exhaustion that accompanied them. And even in these fleeting moments, there was another invisible watch, The gaze of etiquette. Even the way one held bread or a spoon could be regulated because discipline extended to every detail, even the act of eating. In the Victorian mansion, even the simplest gestures were regulated by etiquette. A maid couldn't just serve tea. She had to do so with correct posture, a lowered gaze, and smooth movements. There was a correct way to open doors, hold a tray, even walk the halls. It was as if every moment were a silent rehearsal for a theater performance where there was no applause, only criticism. This constant pressure transformed the body into a tool of discipline. Speech was controlled, few words, low tone, no boldness. Smiles were supposed to be restrained, expressions always serious. It's curious to think that today many still face similar environments, where professionalism is demanded at all costs, stifling spontaneous gestures. The difference is that, back then, this discipline was non negotiable. It was the law of the house. The most intriguing thing is that etiquette served not only to please the masters, but also to reinforce the hierarchy. A misbehaving maid could tarnish the family image. Thus, the weight of the master's reputation fell on the servant's shoulders. Anyone who has felt the pressure of representing a company or group in public knows what it's like to carry that responsibility. Even moments of waiting demanded obedience. The maid couldn't rest her arms in any way, couldn't lean against the wall, couldn't sit without permission. It was like living in an endless choreography, where every wrong step could result in scolding or punishment. This vigilance transformed even silence into a tool of control. Interestingly, the pressure of etiquette also makes us think about how, to this day, we shape our gestures to please. The difference is that in many cases, we choose when and where to apply these rules. For those women, there was no such freedom. Their entire bodies were trained to obey, even when their souls screamed for spontaneity. And, if it was already difficult to bear so many rules and demands, there was another, even greater pain: the unfair salary, so low that it barely allowed one to sustain oneself with dignity, revealing that even the most perfect discipline did not bring the deserved reward. A Victorian maid's salary was so small that it barely covered her most basic needs. They received token sums, insufficient to buy new clothes or save any money. Often the pay came with deductions. Uniforms, substandard food, and even hygiene products were charged to the maid herself. Today, when someone comments about a salary that doesn't even last the month, it directly echoes the reality of these women. This lack of money created a cruel dependency. They knew they couldn't simply quit and look for another job, as almost every house paid the same paltry wage. The alternative was to return to extreme poverty, homeless, and unprotected. It's like when someone today finds themselves stuck in a job they dislike, but need to support themselves because they have no other source of income. The difference is that in the past, there was no social support network or employment benefits. The curious thing is that payment wasn't just in cash. Some families offered part of their support: a simple bed, meager food, sometimes a pair of shoes, as if it were part of their salary. It was almost an invisible currency, masking the exploitation. Anyone who has received benefits instead of a raise understands this feeling. It seems like help. Deep down, it keeps you in the same position. This unfair wage also highlighted how undervalued domestic work was. Although they kept the mansion running, these women were seen as replaceable parts, easily replaced. The logic was simple: if one complained, another would instantly accept it. This idea that there's always someone willing to accept less still resonates in many modern sectors, revealing that exploitation hasn't changed as much as we'd like. And then there was the psychological burden, knowing that all the effort, sweat, and exhausting hours of work weren't translating into a better life. Working just to survive, without the prospect of advancement, undermines dreams and hope. It's like running on a treadmill. The body gets tired, but doesn't move. And even in this scenario, they kept going because survival spoke louder than the desire for freedom. And as if the insufficient salary were not enough, there was also another invisible prison, dependence on employment, which forced many maids to accept any condition imposed to avoid losing the little they had. In Victorian England, most women of humble origins had no choice. Being a housemaid was almost the only path available. Factories were already hiring many female workers, but wages were equally low and conditions even more dangerous. For those who wanted a roof over their heads and some security, life in the mansion seemed to at least guarantee food and shelter. This lack of options made employment a prison in disguise. The dependency was so intense that many accepted humiliation and endless hours just to avoid losing their jobs. There was no job security or fair contracts. All it took was a serious mistake or even an unfair accusation, and they would be sent away with nothing. Anyone who has experienced the fear of being fired without financial preparation can perhaps understand some of the anguish they endured daily. And society reinforced this limitation. For lower class women, studying was not a possibility. Opening a business seemed impossible, and getting married was often just exchanging the servitude of the mansion for that of the husband. Opportunity simply wasn't created. Today, we talk about career freedom and entrepreneurship, but for those women, their destiny was already set before they were even born. This dependence also shaped behavior. They had to always appear obedient, submissive, willing to endure any order. The fear of losing their job outweighed their desire to fight back. It's like when someone remains silent in the face of an abusive boss because they know they need that salary to pay the bills. The difference is that for the maids, there was no social safety net or chance for a fresh start. And yet there was a contradiction. Despite living in dependence, many maids took pride in what they did. For them, keeping their jobs was a sign of survival, of strength in the face of hardship. This silent pride revealed a hidden dignity, but it didn't erase the fact that they were trapped in a system with no way out. And this lack of alternatives wasn't just reflected in work. Even during downtime, life was controlled. After all, even dormitories were shared and monitored, making it clear that privacy was another distant luxury. Sleeping, for the maids, was not exactly resting. The dormitories were communal, almost always in stuffy attics or damp basements with several beds lined up side by side. There was no space to store personal belongings, and any attempt at privacy was quickly nullified by the forced coexistence. Imagine sharing a tiny room with 10 people with no locks on the door and watchful eyes on your every move. The housekeeper kept watch even during rest times. She controlled light out times, permitted conversations, and even the tone of voice in the dormitories. Silence was not only expected, it was demanded. Rest was, therefore, another extension of the house's discipline. Anyone who had lived in boarding schools or student residences can imagine the discomfort, but for them, the difference was that there was no choice or set time to leave. The lack of privacy slowly eroded the sense of individuality. There was no space to reflect alone, write in a journal in peace, or simply sigh unnoticed. Every gesture could be observed, and in some cases, reprimanded. This constant monitoring is very reminiscent of the modern feeling of always being online, monitored by messages, emails, and notifications. The difference is that in the past, there was no way to turn it off. Even personal belongings were minimal. A small box of mementos, perhaps a family photo, or a handkerchief inherited from your mother. Nothing beyond this was permitted. This detail reinforces how the servant's life was shaped by enforced detachment. There was no accumulation of possessions, only the acceptance that almost everything belonged to the house where she worked. This lack of possession also symbolized the absence of identity, and even exhausted, the maids couldn't sleep soundly. At any moment, they might be called to fulfill a request from their employers or receive an unexpected order from the housekeeper. It was as if their sleep were too light, always interrupted by the possibility of being torn from their pillows. Truly resting was, for them, an unattainable privilege. And when the day seemed to finally end, another burden came. Often, they still had to work at night, serving long dinners or parties that lasted into the early hours. The nights, far from meaning rest, were often just the continuation of a day that already seemed endless. After hours of climbing stairs, cleaning rooms, and carrying heavy loads, the maids still had to stay on their feet to serve dinners that could last until the early hours. The halls filled with music, laughter, and lively conversation, but for them, there was only the incessant din of orders that never stopped. The hardest part was maintaining their posture. Even tired, they had to walk lightly, balance trays, smile discreetly, and serve each guest as if they were the first of the night. Imagine standing all day and still holding a heavy tray of crystal glasses without showing weakness. Today, when someone complains about working overtime at the office, they might not imagine that for these women, overtime was routine disguised as normal. Unexpected visitors made things even worse. All it took was for someone to arrive unannounced for the maids to be called back, even when they were about to lie down to rest. The orders came quickly: prepare the room, light a fire, arrange the bed linens. It was like being jolted from sleep by an urgent notification, but with no option to refuse or postpone it. They were available. And there was also the weight of comparison. While patrons and guests drank, laughed, and reveled, the maids moved invisibly, trying not to stumble amidst the luxury that would never be theirs. It was like observing a spectacle from afar, never able to participate. This contrast further highlighted the chasm between the two realities: the party on one side, the burden on the other. The body complained, but the mind was forced to obey. Exhaustion mounted, and yet discipline allowed no mistakes. A spilled glass, a delay in service, and the scolding would come in front of everyone. The night, which for many meant rest or pleasure, for them was just another stage of endless exhaustion. And when the music finally stopped and the halls were empty, the clock already showed that the next day was about to begin, bringing with it a new day of endless work. Victorian maids' working days were so long that the day seemed to have no beginning or end. They woke before sunrise, and often only rested in the early hours of the morning. 14, 16 hours of constant movement, with no real breaks, no time for themselves. Today, when we talk about excessive workloads, we rarely think of this level of exhaustion. It was a routine that drained the body and spirit. The curious thing is that time wasn't measured by clocks, but by tasks. The day only ended when all the fireplaces were cleaned, the rooms tidied, the banquets served, the clothes washed. And if something was delayed, it would drag on even longer. Imagine living without ever knowing for sure when you could stop. It's like running a marathon with no finish line, running because duty compels you, not because there's a victory at the end. The accumulated exhaustion was becoming visible, dark circles under the eyes, calloused hands, pain that never had time to heal. But there was no room for illness. Those who couldn't cope were replaced. Work didn't wait. This feeling is reminiscent of the modern fear of falling behind, but on a much more cruel level because there were no vacations, sick days, or labor rights. Life revolved around a wheel that never stopped. And the hardest part was the lack of balance. There was no time for leisure, for family, for herself. Everything was absorbed by the service. It was as if the maid's identity was reduced to what she did. Today, we talk a lot about mental health and separating work and personal life. For these women, that distinction simply didn't exist. They were their work, from start to finish. Still, there were those who grew accustomed to the rhythm, like someone adapting to a prison too long to remember freedom. The exhausting routine became normal because there was no alternative. And this is a point that makes us reflect. How often, even today, do we accept journeys that drain our energy without realizing we're being shaped by them? And to make the harshness of this routine even worse, there were strict social rules that limited any possibility of building a full personal life, such as getting married or having children. The life of a Victorian servant was marked by prohibitions that went beyond physical labor. They couldn't marry, and if they became pregnant, they were immediately dismissed. Their jobs demanded exclusive dedication, as if a woman ceased to be a person and became merely a. Today, when we talk about balancing professional and personal life, we rarely think of such a rigid reality, where choice was non existent. This cruel rule created a silent dilemma. Many young women dreamed of family, but knew that this dream meant giving up the only security they had. It was like choosing between two prisons, servitude in the mansion or abject poverty on the streets. Imagine being forced to give up something as human as affection in exchange for survival. This tension gnawed at the core, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. The hardest part was that this restriction came with constant surveillance. The housekeeper and the employers closely watched for any sign of romantic involvement between employees. A lingering look, a misinterpreted word, and suspicion soon arose. It was like living under invisible cameras, every gesture monitored. Love, which should have been spontaneous, became forbidden. Still, some maids took risks. Quick encounters in the hallways, hidden notes, glances exchanged in the rush of work. These small gestures were sparks of humanity amidst the weight of discipline. Anyone who has experienced a secret romance might understand the mix of adrenaline and fear, but for them, the risk was losing not only their relationship, but also their livelihood. This limitation demonstrates how Victorian society viewed lower class women as disposable pieces, useful only as long as they were available to serve. There was no room for personal desires or life projects beyond work. Personal life was denied, as if it were a luxury reserved only for the upper classes. And even with so many restrictions, exemplary behavior was still expected of them, shaped by Victorian moral rigidity, which defined unattainable standards of purity and obedience. Victorian morality hung like a heavy shadow over all of society, but it fell even more heavily on servants. Absolute purity, blind obedience, and modesty that went beyond their work etiquette were expected of them. It was as if the family's reputation depended on the silent behavior of these women. A slip up, even a small one, could tarnish not only the servant's image, but also that of the household that employed her. This rigidity shaped even the most banal gestures. They couldn't laugh loudly, couldn't talk excessively, couldn't express personal opinions. Silence and restraint were seen as virtue. Today, when we value authenticity and freedom of expression, it's almost difficult to imagine a life where even the tone of voice was regulated. But for them, the weight of this discipline was as natural as breathing. Interestingly, Victorian morality functioned as a showcase. While employers displayed virtues in public, they often cultivated contradictions in private. Servants, however, had no such right. They had to constantly maintain the facade. It's like modern social media, where celebrities and influencers live under the obligation to appear perfect. The difference is that for servants, this image didn't bring fame, only pressure. And there was also community surveillance. Malicious comments could ruin a young maid's reputation. Rumors, even without proof, were enough to prompt dismissal. This rigidity demonstrates how power was also sustained by social fear, not just house rule. Anyone who has been the target of unfair gossip knows what it's like to feel one's life crumble without defense. Ultimately, this morality didn't seek true virtue, but control. It was a way to keep servants submissive, with no room for questioning. The paradox is that while demanding purity, employers were often the first to violate this rule, imposing harassment in unfair situations. Victorian morality, therefore, was selective, designed to serve the powerful, and when the maids failed to live up to this unattainable standard, the punishments came in subtle or humiliating forms, revealing how even moral discipline doubled as punishment. The punishments did not always come in the form of physical violence, but they were equally cruel. All it took was a slip, a dropped tray, a slight delay, a poorly polished glass, for the maid to be reprimanded in front of everyone. The public scolding stung more than a slap because it destroyed her dignity in front of colleagues and even guests. It was a constant reminder that in that house, any mistake could turn into a. The humiliations varied. Some were forced to redo exhausting tasks, such as cleaning an entire salon again, even though they were already sparkling. Others heard harsh words that diminished their value as people. Imagine dedicating hours to a job and being told you're worthless. This wound doesn't appear on the body, but it corrodes from within. Today, when we talk about workplace harassment, we are dealing with the same logic, just in different guises. Immediate dismissal was the ultimate punishment, and it required little justification. An accusation, a rumor, or even a dirty look was enough to get a maid fired. And losing her job meant losing her home and livelihood all at once. There was no prior warning, no right to defense. It was like living every day with a sword suspended over your head, ready to fall at any moment. The most perverse aspect of these punishments was their subtlety. There were no constant shouting, but rather small corrections that together undermined self-esteem. A disapproving look, an impatient gesture, a sarcastic comment, signals that communicated disapproval without the need for harsh words. Anyone who has lived with people who control more through silence than outbursts knows how heavy this is. And despite everything, the maids had to accept it, swallow their pride, and carry on. There was no room to complain. There was no union or law to protect them. The only way out was to obey more, to try to do more right, to live on constant alert. This psychological pressure kept the mansion's gears turning with cruel efficiency. History, as it's often told, has forgotten these women. Books celebrate queens, elegant ladies, and great lords, but rarely mention the servants who kept things running smoothly. They were the invisible foundation of a system that gleamed from above, but only held together by anonymous hands that tended to every detail. It's curious to think how without them, Victorian life would never have functioned as we know it. This invisibility isn't just a lack of names and records, it's also a lack of recognition. Few diaries or memoirs were written by servants, and almost none have survived. Their stories survive in fragments, employers' reports, payroll records, governesses' notes. It's as if these women's voices had been erased, leaving only the echo of what others wrote about them. And yet its signs are still everywhere. Every polished piece of furniture, every impeccable dress, every perfectly served dinner bears the invisible mark of those who worked behind the scene. It's like looking at an old photograph and realizing that outside the main scene, there was an invisible crowd holding the frame together. Without them, the image would have collapsed. This invisibility also makes us wonder how many people today continue to live anonymously, sustaining systems without ever receiving credit. Think of the street cleaners who clean the streets before dawn, the late night workers who supply grocery stores, the technicians who fix machines while everyone else sleeps. The modern world still relies on invisible hands, and we rarely stop to acknowledge them. And even though official history has forgotten them, every detail of their routines carries lessons about resilience, discipline, and dignity amid oppression. Victorian servants may not have had a voice in the books, but they left silent marks on the way society functioned and continues to function. And precisely for this reason, when one of them managed to break this cycle and reach a prominent position, such as that of housekeeper, it was seen as a rare achievement within a universe that seemed to offer no way out. Amidst so much oppression, some maids found a glimmer of hope, the possibility of rising through the ranks and becoming a governess. This achievement was neither simple nor quick. It required years of discipline, impeccable work, and an untouchable reputation. It was like climbing a narrow ladder, step by step, never knowing if there would be enough room to reach the top. Yet for many, this was the only possible dream. The housekeeper had more authority, more respect, and even her own room, which in itself represented an immense luxury compared to the shared dormitories. For those who came from anonymity, having keys commanding tasks and being heard was almost like gaining a new identity. It's like that employee who starts at the lowest level of the company and after much effort finally becomes a manager. Small for some, enormous for those who lived at the bottom. But this advancement also came at a price. The governess lived in a middle ground. She wasn't part of the family, but she was also no longer equal to the maids she commanded. She had to be strict, maintain her distance, and often mete out the same punishments she had once received. It was a bitter victory, fraught with responsibility and loneliness. Anyone who has held a leadership position knows what it's like to feel the weight of being caught between two worlds. The curious thing is that these achievements were rarely celebrated. There was no celebration, no public recognition, just a new title and new obligations. And yet, these small victories were fueled by a desire for dignity. The governess, however limited, carried with her proof that it was possible to emerge from anonymity, albeit by a narrow path. This kind of ascension shows how, even in oppressive systems, human beings find ways to resist and seek improvement. It wasn't about achieving complete freedom, but about earning small margins of respect. And for those women, that was already a lot. And amidst these specific achievements, there were also rare moments of leisure, small breaks that, even if short, offered a respite from the weight of routine. Leisure for a Victorian servant was so rare that it became almost a solemn event. One free afternoon a month was the most many could manage, and yet this time was not devoted to rest as we imagine it today. Most used these hours to go to church, not by spontaneous choice, but because religion was seen as an extension of discipline and morality. It was rest, yes, but fraught with duty. Going to church also represented a moment of social interaction. There, the maids met other young women in similar situations, exchanged glances, sometimes quick confidences, and shared the feeling of not being alone. It was like a brief respite from the burden of anonymity. Today, when we think of leisure, we think of travel, movies, and books. For them, it was enough to leave the mansion and breathe different air for a few hours. Even so, leisure didn't mean complete freedom. Time was short, and the demands of the household loomed large. Many spent their free time washing their own clothes, mending uniforms, or taking care of personal needs. It was like using their weekend free time only to pay bills or organize the house, a rest that isn't truly restful. And there was also the psychological impact. Waiting weeks for a few hours of rest created a sense of exaggerated value. That afternoon was becoming precious, and the frustration of not enjoying it fully could weigh even more heavily. It's like when you wait all year for a short vacation, and when it arrives, time seems to slip through your fingers. Even during these rare breaks, leisure was not seen as a right, but as a concession, something given by employers, not earned by servants. This distinction makes all the difference. Resting at the behest of others doesn't have the same flavor as resting on one's own merit, and this further reinforced the feeling of dependence. And while the routine seemed closed in endless circles, outside the walls of the mansion, voices of journalists and writers began to emerge, denouncing the excess of domestic life, bringing controversy to society. As the 19th century progressed, voices began to rise up against the burden of domestic life. Writers, journalists, and even social reformers began to denounce the near slavish conditions of servants. In newspaper columns and pamphlets, they described the exhausting routine, the paltry wages, and the lack of rights. Although these criticisms didn't immediately change the reality, they opened space for reflections that until then had been hidden behind the doors of mansions. These accounts were controversial because they challenged the perfect image that elite families like to project. While the salons glittered with lavish parties, the uncomfortable idea began to emerge that this shine was sustained by invisible sweat. It was like revealing the hidden gears of an expensive watch. No one wanted to see the grease, but it was there, indispensable for its operation. Some novels of the time also began to include servants as characters, albeit in a secondary role, highlighting the contrast between the hardships of the lower floors and the comforts of the upper floors. These literary representations helped raise awareness among readers who were beginning to see inequality differently. It was a seed planted amid the harsh terrain of Victorian morality. Still, there was resistance. Many employers saw these criticisms as exaggerations or attempts to destabilize the social order. They claimed to offer sustenance, housing, and even protection to their servants. This discourse, however, hid the reality of exploitation. It's curious how even today certain arguments appear in similar contexts when attempts are made to disguise inequalities under the guise of benefits. These controversies gradually created gaps for future changes. Labor laws began to be discussed, albeit tentatively, and public perception of domestic service began to change. It wasn't an immediate revolution, but a slow process made up of insistent voices that refused to accept silence. And while society debated the first signs of change, the routine inside the mansions continued its course, but with a destiny already set. The slow decline of the system that for so long seemed unshakable. As the 19th century progressed, the gears of society began to shift. The growth of cities, the emergence of new industries, and the slow expansion of opportunities for lower class women began to erode the absolute strength of the domestic system. Mansions, once dependent on dozens of servants, began to see this labor force dwindle. It was the beginning of a silent but irreversible decline. Young women themselves began to seek alternatives. Factories, though harsh, offered more stable wages and greater independence. Urban life also brought new forms of sociability, freer from the suffocating control of mansions. It's like when a generation decides to leave the countryside to try life in the cities, a slow movement, but one that transforms everything around it. Wealthy families resisted this change. Many tried to maintain the same number of servants, but realized it was no longer sustainable. Excessive luxury began to be replaced by more practical and less expensive practices. Some services were outsourced, while others simply stopped being performed with such rigor. The splendor of Victorian routine no longer seemed. This decline also reflected a cultural shift. Society began to view domestic work not just as a woman's duty, but as an area that required limits and recognition. It was a tentative step toward labor rights that would only be truly achieved in the following century. But for those who lived under the weight of the mansions, it already represented a breath of transformation. And although many maids didn't live to see major changes, their stories echo throughout this process. The system that seemed eternal proved fragile in the face of social transformation. What seemed like an unshakable routine began to unravel, demonstrating that even the most solid foundations can give way to time. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative connects with us today, reflecting on how the structures we accept as natural may one day prove to be temporary and unjust. Have you noticed how the lives of these women, forgotten by history, hold lessons that still resonate today? The exhausting routine of Victorian servants reminds us of something simple yet powerful. Often the foundation that sustains the comfort of some is built on the invisible efforts of and. If we stop and think about it, this doesn't just happen in the past, it still happens today, in different forms. So the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you continue to see life only through its shiny surface? Or will you begin to appreciate those behind the scenes, including yourself when you feel invisible? This reflection can transform the way you approach your own daily life. Perhaps the hardest lesson is this: don't accept that repetition and exhaustion define your destiny. If in the past these women had no choice, today we do. The question I ask you is, are you willing to change what needs to be changed in your life, or will you repeat cycles without realizing it? Think about it. And if this story made you reflect, if it touched you in any way, take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories I'll share here. After all, every detail can open your mind and make you see the world differently.